Hi, Joan.
Hi, how are you?
I'm good. So it's so wonderful to be here with you in April 2024 at Xavier Hufkens in Brussels. And kind of amazing to think that your last solo exhibition in Europe was in Madrid in the 1960s. So what a wonderful homecoming. How are you feeling about that?
Oh, it feels marvelous. I had a wonderful time in Madrid. I lived there for a long time, 8 years almost, and was working as an artist there. At that time, I was still working in the abstract expressionist mode, and that work was exhibited widely in both Spain and South America. So coming back and seeing an exhibition here really gives me great pleasure.
And I think something that's also really interesting about your work, beyond the work itself, is also your work challenging structures, right? When you wanted to show this work, there wasn't a gallery to show it. You had to kind of create your own gallery, correct?
Exactly. Yeah. Well, it was considered untouchable, essentially. The gallerists would look at it and they say, oh, it's great, but I can't do that. So it was like a self-imposed kind of a censorship by the art structure. But not only the art structure, those issues were left to the commercial sex.
Yeah.
And they only exaggerated the deficiencies in the system, and played on them. And one of the things that was so very important to me was that this was supposedly a sexual liberation, but it really was a liberation for men and a commercialization of women's bodies. And I also felt very strongly that unless women really understood their own bodies and their own sexual desires and had the freedom to express those, they would always be subservient, even in the political sense. So I started my work in that area to try to change the way women felt about themselves, rather from an external force of change the structure, and that will change everything.
No, and I love that about your work, this kind of expanding fields of perception, right? Some of these things, like to you, you had an insight and that was obvious about empowering women to look at themselves and their sexuality from an internal rather than an external way.
Yeah. And because even some of the things that were thought of as liberation at that time was really more of the same.
Of course,
and that was part of the problem.
Yeah, I have a mentor, her name is Chus Martinez, and she was talking about how, today education structure is allowing women, but you're never going to teach a woman to be a better man.
Exactly.
So sometimes, these, like you say, you're led into a structure, but the structure entirely needs to change.
It needs to change. But again, the psychological development of women has been so repressive in so many ways. I mean, the external demands made on them, that it was impossible to change the outcomes, So one had to start from the beginning. And I was very willing to go ahead and try to do that because, of course, I felt like I could change the world. We all do when we're 20 years old, right?
Hopefully we still do, but yes. Yeah. I think it's also when you talk about 20 years old or 30 years old or 40 years old or 50 years old, it's also so interesting how invisible or how we don't talk about the needs of women as we age. Like I have certain friends going through menopause and they told me that actually we can predict this. It will happen to everyone, but we just don't talk about it within society.
Well, I think the truth is we don't talk about anybody.
Yeah.
But for women particularly who are sort of disappeared after 35, they're considered over the hill. But I never started out thinking I was making work about aging. It's just that I was aging and I was using my own body. And so it was evident. And I was determined that my work would not be just a superficial, seductive female figure, but would be true in a way, and that would enhance one's sexual desire, but would also not doctor it up and make it into some kind of a Hollywood production. So I kept seeing the signs of aging in my own body and decided that was okay to use, and that aging was another social problem, quotation marks, in not only our country but everywhere. That youth was the example of health. Well, youth isn't the only kind of health.
Totally.
Right?
Maybe to go back to something before about your work and how it like expands fields of perception or fields of vision. Could you tell us a bit about the use of the cameras and of mirrors in your work?
It's sort of almost all of the things that happen in my work happen incidentally, right? And then I catch them and use it. So I didn't want the work to be perceived as another picture of women made by men. And I wanted it to be clear that this was a work of a woman artist. And I wanted it to be clear that the artist was the woman seeing herself rather than looking at a mirror or looking through a man's eyes. So for that reason, I took to the camera and started taking pictures from my own point of view. That's why the heads were left out, because you never really see your head. And I also wanted you to see yourself and experience yourself rather than looking in a mirror and seeing a reflection. So for all of those reasons, I turned to the camera and I turned the camera on myself. And that was how I got those first self-images. And of course, doing that made those images somewhat abstract also, so that they related not only to me and my body, but to nature, landscape, everything, you know, and it became a whole abstract construction that still pointed to the specifics of what I was intending.
There's also a painting in the entrance where you're seeing yourself, you're seeing the mirror with the reflection, you're seeing a mannequin as well, and you're seeing a camera. Could you maybe talk to us a bit through all of those elements in that work?
Well, I've been working for many, many years, and just looking at myself gets boring after a while. So I tried, what other things could I use that would be interesting and would expand the conversation. And so I came across some discarded mannequins in the street, and I said, that's it, and brought them into my studio and did a whole series on mannequins. And the reason I used the mannequins is because I felt that they also spoke to the kind of commercialization that I was interested in criticizing. And those pieces gave me a way of comparing the body to the manufactured image. And so I juxtaposed the two. And then I still wanted you to see that it was the woman making the painting. So I had to get into it myself somehow, and had to use the camera in the mirror to make that happen. And I was also interested in the way women's idea of themselves are constructed socially, and they're constructed through reflection, the glass, the camera, right? And the frame. So there were several pictures where I also used the frame, the idea. There are certain ideas that are framed and mass-produced and projected to one all the time. But once I get into the painting, it's about the painting itself. And it becomes about how I use the paint and how I construct it abstractly and how this color works with that color and so on.
Yeah, I know there's also like, the colors are really seductive as well. Could you maybe talk to us a bit about that?
Well, I wasn't willing to let go of the abstraction of color, because that was the pleasure and the passion, right? And so I just decided to use it anyhow, even though it was supposedly realism, and nothing is really realism. So it's always a kind of construction of one kind or another, and use the color as freely as I could and still make it register.
And I love, there was another quote of yours where you were talking about using paint as kind of an instrument of joy, and I think that you really captured
Well,
that.
it is, because joy happens in the pleasure of a moment without any thought, practically. It's just something that's an immediate response. And I always have that immediate response to color, and most people do, I think.
And I know, what's great, you're still working today. Like, this is a show that's, a big survey of, many, many decades of work.
Yeah.
But where are you finding inspiration today? Like, where do you look for that joy?
Well, the joy is still in the paint, because that's what I love, and the color also. Content is more difficult because it's difficult to find ways to deal with aging that don't conform to the popular concept, oh, poor thing.
Oh, yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
So I don't want any poor things in my paintings, right? I want a sense of power that age gives one, a sense of knowledge that one gets. All of those things, I want to be contained in that image in some way. And I want it to resonate in some way that is not pedantic, that doesn't say you should or you shouldn't, but simply is there and holds its own place.
So something that's really interesting to me, beyond looking at the artist as someone who creates art or the curator as someone who creates exhibitions, like, how do we actually create the conditions for great art to be made? And activism and institution building is also part of that. Or I know that activism and also working with other female artists and opening up, there was something about how the number of women entering art school is so high, but the number of women that are hired into art school is so low. If you could talk a bit about that side of your journey, which is in parallel to your work, that would be great.
Well, when I first returned after living in Europe, first of all, in Europe, I understood in Madrid how political art was. And when I came back, I immediately joined up with other artists. It was a great time in New York City. It was a dangerous and difficult time, but it was a wonderful community of artists. And I first went to a group called the Art Workers Coalition. And that was both men and women. And they were dealing with all kinds of issues, and everybody had something to say. The women in those groups still were not looked at with as being important. They served purpose of camp followers and coffee carriers. But even though they were there as other artists, and so they withdrew and formed into their own groups. And that was a very important time for women artists in New York City. And it was high activism, and it was very exciting and interesting because we did things like we would meet in each other's studios. So we got to see work that was never exhibited, and got to talk to each other about the issues that we were interested in. And there are many women who I was friends with at that time, who have remained personal friends throughout my life. I mean, it was a real bonding possibility. And later on, there were the Guerrilla Girls, because even though we did all of that, there wasn't much change, hardly any. And the people, we were disparaged. Oh, those women, right? They weren't important. And it was very difficult for women to get visibility still, even after all of that kind of activity. So the Guerrilla Girls did things like how many gallerists had how many different women in their galleries. And of course, it expanded to include how many blacks. We understood finally that the necessity was political on broad grounds, not only on the narrow grounds of, quote, women artists, but on the broader grounds of people who are left out of the political system, essentially, and whose interests are not being looked at.
I've been working with this young collective of women in Uzbekistan. So there's 200 women, and their collective's called Kizlar, which means girls. And they were talking about the problems that women have to be both the spectacle and the spectator within their own lives. They don't get to be the protagonist, or
Exactly.
It's still happening today.
It's still even what the work is about.
Exactly.
You know, I mean, how do you get to be the protagonist? You know, how do you get to be the actor? How do you get to be the subject and not the object of what happens? I remember as a child being told, oh, you can't do that, you're a woman. A woman needs to make babies. You know, that's what it's about. And we're still there. We're still there. We've gone, you know, back to that same old argument.
Yeah. Well, that's why I think it's such a gift to be able to be here with you.
Well, it's also a gift for me, don't forget, that people are still interested. It's a great thing that they're interested in the ideas that have been interested in, but that's a double-edged sword. The fact that those ideas are still there and need to be addressed. But what's not a double-edged sword is that the work exists and it maintains its own identity and has its own power. And that power existed back then and exists now. And I'm grateful that I was able to do that. Yeah.